Starting off this countdown, we have Gabriel Nagy. In 1987, 44-year-old father of two, Gabriel Nagy, left his home to run some errands in the city. A couple hours later, he called his wife telling her that he was on his way back home for lunch. But Gabriel never returned home.
I'd be pissed as his wife, like, I made lunch, Gabriel.
Where are you? The sandwich is getting cold. Yeah. Gabriel.
We shouldn't be laughing.
Yeah.
Oh, I mean,
actually no.
It's fine. To add to this mystery, his car was found smashed in, abandoned at the side of the road, and Gabriel was still nowhere to be found.
This case went cold for 23 years. There were no signs of Gabriel anywhere.
That was until police got word of a man receiving Medicare whose records seemed to match Gabriel's.
Turns out that Gabriel got into a car accident on his way home that caused dissociative fugue. He couldn't remember a single thing. Not knowing who he was or where he lived, he wandered around the streets for 23 years.
That just baffles me so hard. He literally started his life over after this car accident. Can you imagine completely just forgetting about your family and kids? Like, imagine how his family must have felt to lose him and then get him back. As soon as police found him, they started showing him photos of his family, and he slowly began to remember who he was. Coming in at number 9 is Petra Pazicka. It was July of 1984, and 24-year-old German university student Petra was expected home one weekend just for some family time, you know. Family time, as we do after uni, just eat that home-cooked food. But the girl never showed up, which prompted the police to start investigating her disappearance. Detectives turned to a popular crime show at the time for help, and convicted murderer and rapist Gunther K. was suspected for her death. He had admitted to killing someone in the area before, and when provoked by the police, he confessed to murdering Petra as well. You'd think the story just ended there and that Bob was your uncle after that, but Bob is barely even a distant relative right now. Turns out Petra was alive and well and had intensively planned her disappearance for bare time. She had been going by different aliases and was renting an apartment with money she'd been saving for quite a while. The only reason she was even discovered is because there was a burglary in her home, which she reported to the police. When they got there, she told them her name was Mrs. Schneider, but they asked for her ID, after which she had to confess. Petra never came clean about why she decided to disappear to begin with, and continued to maintain that she didn't want any contact with her relatives. That must hurt. As her relatives, I'd be like, hello, I just want to love you.
Coming in at number 8, we have Elizabeth Smart. In 2002, Elizabeth Smart was taken from her home by a handyman that used to work for the family. The man was Brian David Mitchell, but went by Emmanuel to the Smart family. On June 5th, 2002, Brian broke into the family's home and kidnapped Elizabeth at knife point. Her sister, Mary Catherine, who was in bed next to her, pretended to be asleep to avoid being harmed. Brian and his wife then held Elizabeth captive for 9 months at a camp in the woods. It wasn't until October of 2002 when Mary Catherine recognized that the police sketches of the kidnapper looked an awful lot like their handyman, Emmanuel. As a result, he was captured by the police and Elizabeth was rescued from her kidnappers. Now Elizabeth is 32 years old and is a child safety activist, but her case still remains one of the most high-profile abduction cases in modern times.
Filling at number 7 slot is Edgar LaTulip. Now for some background, Edgar was mentally handicapped in a way which had him functioning as a 12-year-old kid. He had tried committing suicide multiple times, and in 1986 he had just been released from a hospital following his latest attempt, and he was put in a group home. One day he boarded a bus heading towards the south side of Lake Ontario and disappeared just like that, or so people thought. Since he had tried taking his life before, the first assumption his family had was that the 21-year-old had just killed himself.
But turns out that Edgar had suffered from a head injury that caused him to lose all of his memories. Similar to Gabriel's case, not knowing who he was, Edgar decided to make a new life for himself with a new name. 30 years later, Edgar started having weird flashbacks of his old life. He even remembered his real name. He shared this information with a social worker who then discovered that he was a missing person. DNA tests confirmed his identity, which means he essentially solved his own cold missing persons case, which is really cool.
Okay, I have a question with this.
Yeah.
Okay, so he's lost his memories.
Yeah.
But like, how do you realize at 21 years old, I don't know where he is, but he's like, oh, I don't know anything, let me just create a new life. Like, how do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
like, how am I
saying.
Like, how are you like, oh, I don't know anything, my name is Edgar now, like, or my name is Tim, like, I just don't get it.
Well, obviously, I think he like knows his basic things, but not.
Like, clearly not.
I don't know.
Like, you know what I mean? How'd you have a head injury and then wake up and be like, okay, I don't remember anything, time for a new life? I wouldn't even remember that I don't remember anything.
Just wander the streets.
Until someone told him, like, dude, are you okay?
Yeah, basically, it's sad.
Now at number 6 is Nguyen T. Van. Back in 1992, Nguyen's mum locked her out of the house for coming home after her curfew. I'm guessing the punishment was only gonna last a few hours, so Nguyen decided to pass the time by going to a karaoke bar with some friends. Gotta love it, gotta have it. Now this older woman offered them all a ride home after the bar, and the kids slowly fell asleep in the car and woke up to find themselves no longer in Vietnam but in China. The woman was a human trafficker and told the girls they were either gonna get sold to Chinese men for marriage or they were gonna get murdered. The choice was theirs, and I'm guessing nobody picked the latter. Nguyen spent the next 21 years married to a Chinese farmer, during which she tried escaping multiple times but failed. Eventually she made friends with this Vietnamese driver who helped her escape. He smuggled her out of the house in a pig truck and left her at the border. Eventually she entered Vietnam and went looking for her family in the same house they lived in decades prior. She wasn't even sure if her parents were alive because they would have been in like their 80s by then, but she was reunited with her family, and damn Zaddy, what a story. I've honestly watched so many documentaries about like these women being sold in China to different old men, and it's baffling and it's disgusting.
We're now at our 5th and halfway mark with the unidentified missing woman. Okay, this next case is actually quite hilarious. Now I know what you're probably thinking. Lindsay, missing people are not a laughing matter. I know. But wait till you hear about this case. So a woman was part of a group tour of an Icelandic volcano, but during the tour she decided to leave to, you know, freshen up and change her clothes. That's when she was reported missing. But it doesn't stop there. This woman returned to her tour group and actually joined the search party looking for herself. The woman was described as Asian but fluent in English, about 5'3" and wearing dark clothes. Took her quite some time before she realized that she was also Asian, fluent in English, about 5'3", and was previously wearing dark clothes. That's when she announced to everyone that she was the missing person. So she quite literally found herself. Like, can you imagine that? People are out looking for you and you're like, oh, yeah, who are you looking for? Okay, I'll help. This woman actually seems an awful lot like me, huh? Hey guys, surprise, it's actually me, you know, like, it's actually funny.
Okay, at number 4, you guys, is Cora Hood, and this one is truly wild. Probably not as wild as that one though, because that was bloody hilarious. Illinois in 1917, argument at home caused Cora to leave her husband and kids and never return. Damn, can you imagine your mum just leaving the house to cool off after a fight and she just never comes back? Mommy issues as hell. Now an intense search was underway, but she was never found. Then in 1996, a full 16 years later, a skeleton was found that police thought was Cora's. A funeral was held and she was legally declared dead, but 10 years later a DNA test proved the remains were not Cora. Plot twist.
The DNA test came back negative. The body they thought was Cora's was not. As a result, police reopened the case and started to search for Cora again, until they actually found her. For real this time. Turns out that she was in Jacksonville and claims that she left her family because she didn't know how to take care of her 4 kids. So she left and let her sister adopt them.
But I feel like surely there are better ways to handle that situation
Yeah,
than
not just
disappear.
like, here sister, take my kids.
Can't handle this! Cora was found at 84 years old and her sons had already died by then. She didn't remember much, but at least she wasn't dead. But then again, who the hell's body was that they found?
True.
Who's that?
Whose body was that?
Who's that though?
Ooh. Dun dun dun.
Filling at number 3 slot is Hiro Onada. In the middle of World War II, 22-year-old Lieutenant Hiro Onada was deployed to Lubang Island in the Philippines on what was essentially a suicide mission. While there, most of his followers were captured or killed, but he and a few others managed to escape into the foothills. The group launched many guerrilla attacks on the locals, and they remained there even after Japan surrendered post the atomic bombings. Everyone had assumed Hiro was captured, missing, or dead, but even so they airdropped leaflets into the area announcing that the war was over and to stop their attacks. The group thought this was all a trap by the US and continued fighting. By 1972, Onada was the only one left in there, but everyone presumed he was dead. An adventurer called Norio Suzuki went to search for him or his body and actually did find him in 1974. The lieutenant refused to surrender unless ordered to, like the man was still living in World War II 30 years after it ended. Can you imagine? Suzuki actually found Onada's elderly commanding officer and flew him to Labang just to finally relieve the soldier. I'd be like, dude, do you not want to shower? Like, do you not want to go home and relax? Like, you've been through so much.
In our second spot, we have the Cleveland abductions. Between 2002 and 2004, a man named Errol Castro kidnapped 3 different women. These women were Michelle Knight, Amanda Berry, and Georgina DeJesus. They were held captive in Castro's home in Cleveland, Ohio until 2013. On May 6, 2013, Castro forgot to lock up Amanda Berry's door. This allowed her to run downstairs and alert one of the neighbors. The neighbor opened the front door for them and called the police. The girls were rescued and Castro was sentenced to life. But after being locked away for just a month, Castro took his life in his cell. And in our number 1 spot, we have Jamie Kloss. On October 15, 2018, Jake Patterson entered Jamie's family's home, killed her parents, and kidnapped her. Apparently, he became obsessed with Jamie after seeing her board her school bus one day. From there, he knew that that was the girl he wanted to take. Jamie was then held captive for 88 days.
She was forced to stay under Patterson's bed for 12 hours at a time and wasn't given a lot of food or water or even allowed to go to the bathroom. Patterson also put boxes filled with weights around the bed so that if Jamie moved in attempts to get out, he would know and then punish her. I remember how much news coverage this case got. It was actually insane.
Yeah, I was following it.
Yeah, I was like, Jamie, we'll find you.
However, on January 10th, 2019, when her kidnapper left the house, Jamie mustered up enough courage to push the boxes away and escape his home. She approached a woman out walking her dog and immediately was taken to a neighbor's house and called the police.
Jamie was reunited with her aunt and uncle who are now her legal guardians, and Patterson was caught and confessed to the murders and the kidnapping. Can you imagine escaping that whole ordeal, going through it to begin with, and then having to deal with the loss of your parents at the same time?
Yeah, she's strong. And the fact that she had enough courage to push away those boxes and just run. Whew.
Oh god.
Now, number 10, J.C. Lee Dugard. J.C. Dugard is one of the most widely known cases of an abduction survivor ever recorded, with J.C. getting abducted in 1991 by Philip Garrido and his wife Nancy, when J.C. was just 11 years old. And J.C. spent a huge portion of her life in captivity, being held by the couple for 18 years, even bearing 2 children. In 2009 is when things started to look up, as Garrido brought him and Dugard's children to the UC Berkeley campus. And when 2 campus officers felt that Garrido was suspicious, they ended up running a background check and discovering that he was a convicted offender, and that he was also in violation of his parole. They also noticed that he was not on record as having any children, which aroused even more suspicion. This is when police became involved and decided to arrest Garrido and his wife because of all the suspicions. They ended up also rescuing JC and her 2 children, and since her release, she's been doing everything possible to have a normal life, even writing a best-selling book based on her experience called A Stolen Life. And at number 9, Steven Stainer. Next up is Steven Stainer, who not only saved himself from kidnapping, but also saved another victim. In 1972, when Stainer was just 7 years old, he was kidnapped by Kenneth Parnell, and unfortunately after his kidnapping, he was frequently abused by Parnell. However, he did let him leave the house and get an education, with Parnell enrolling him in various schools under different names. But then many years later, Parnell thought that Stainer was getting too old, so he decided to kidnap another boy, who was just 5 years old at the time, named Timothy White. But Stainer was not going to let another boy go through the pain that he had been through, and decided that they were both going to escape. And that's exactly what happened in 1980. But unfortunately, even though Stainer and White were able to escape, it was very hard for Stainer to readjust back to normal life after the kidnapping, and he suffered with drugs and alcohol practically the entire time that he was free, then later passing away in a tragic motorcycle accident when he was only 24 years old. In at number 8, Robert McDonough. Back in 2013, Robert McDonough, who was a 73-year-old man with dementia, wandered out of his home in Maine. When his family realized he was missing, they quickly reported it to police, who then led a 14-hour search to find the man. And just when people were about to give up is when a miracle happened, and the next morning when ABC was about to report on the incident live outside of McDonough's home is when he ended up wandering right into the shot behind the reporter. And thankfully the reporter was then able to report a positive story, way different than he originally thought. And at number 7, Lucy Ann Johnson. Lucy Ann Johnson disappeared from her home in 1961, leaving her husband and 8-year-old daughter behind to wonder what happened to her. Many years later, in 2013, her daughter Linda wanted to reopen the case and placed an ad in the Yukon News about her mother. Then a woman named Rhonda ended up contacting Linda, saying that she was Linda's half-sister, and the missing woman Lucy was her mom as well. Because of this connection, Linda was then reintroduced to her mother after 52 years of being apart, telling her daughter that she ended up running away from their home because her husband had been harmful towards her. And at number 6, Edgar Latulip. Edgar Latulip was presumed dead after he disappeared from a mental hospital in 1986. Latulip was mentally ill, and he made several attempts on his life in the past, which made it an easy decision for the hospital to presume him as dead. But many years later, it was discovered that he wasn't dead, and not only that, but he was incredibly close to his home. It was discovered that he suffered a head injury, and that caused him to lose his memory. But roughly 30 years after his disappearance is when he started having flashbacks about his old life, and remembered his name, later sharing it with a social worker. Then after the social worker ran his name, they discovered that Edgar was a missing person, and he was able to reunite with his loved ones. Halfway through at number 5, Winston Bright. The disappearance of Winston Bright was a very curious case, as he had left for work one morning, but never ended up returning. This all took place one day in 1992, and after looking for him for many years, in 2000, a judge ruled that Bright was dead, and his wife ended up collecting his pension money, as she was entitled to it by law. Then out of nowhere, 20 years after he had disappeared, Bright ended up showing up at his wife's door, calling himself a completely different name, and also demanding his pension money from her. He ended up claiming that he had amnesia for 20 years, and then tried to win his pension from Verizon, the company that he worked for. But when all the facts were presented, it didn't look like anyone was buying his story, and a judge concluded that this man had just abandoned his family in hopes that he could come back many years later and collect a fat paycheck. But thankfully this didn't end up being the case, and he was denied all the benefits. In at number 4, Rick Hazelton. Rick Hazelton was found by a good friend who wanted answers about his disappearance. The New York man was declared dead after disappearing in 1986, but 3 decades later he was found after a childhood friend noticed a sketch of a man that looked incredibly similar to him in Nashville, Tennessee, and the friend Brian Pynchon enlisted the help of a retired officer from Nashville to help him track down the man. Hazelton said that one day he received a letter in the mail stating that he was being investigated as a missing person, and figured it was just some sort of mistake. Then 2 weeks later, police came to his door and confirmed the fact that the man was Rick Hazelton. Rick spoke of his disappearance, saying it was essentially just a big misunderstanding, telling the news that, quote, "I didn't think anyone really cared, so I just made my own life and did it." Then saying that after going around the country as a street performer, decided to settle down in Oregon with his family, where he has spent the last 20 years. Then adding the lack of technology made it a lot more difficult to keep in touch with loved ones, saying that he simply just fell out of touch with his family. And I guess I can see how you might fall out of touch, but after 30 years it's definitely a choice if you haven't at least tried to contact your family, right? Like, you'd think he would try something if he did want to talk to them, but up to him, I guess. And at number 3, Amanda Eller. Amanda Eller is a woman that went missing after she was hiking on a trail in the Mawako Forest Reserve on Maui, Hawaii. Eller was missing for roughly 2 weeks in the forest before she was rescued, and a helicopter came to airlift her out. She was found walking barefoot between 2 waterfalls and waving her arms. Apparently, Eller wandered deep in the Makau Forest Reserve after she fractured her leg while hiking. She was reported missing the next day, and search parties were quickly sent after her. 2 weeks later, rescuers found her with minor injuries, 15 pounds lighter and in pretty good condition. It seemed that her career as a physical therapist and knowledge of yoga is what saved her life. In at number 2, Carlos Sanchez Ortiz de Salazar. Carlos is a man that did not want to be found, but even though he actively avoided it, it still ended up happening. After Carlos had gone missing for 1 day, many assumed the worst, as he had been depressed and had taken attempts on his life before. After vanishing in 1995, de Salazar was officially declared dead in 2010. Then close to 20 years later, 2 mushroom pickers who were wandering the coastline stumbled across his secret hiding place inside a nature reserve. Since the men were stunned by him, they decided to call for help. When a ranger arrived hours later, Salazar explained that he had been on the coast since 1997, and even though he begged Spanish officials to not tell his family and let him go back into hiding, they still contacted his family. But once they came to reunite with him, he was already long gone once again. And taking the top spot, we got Aaron Ralston, whose story of survival is so unique that there's a whole movie based off his experience, called 127 Hours. Ralston was climbing boulders in Colorado when he got caught and pinned under an 800-pound boulder. He stood there trapped for 5 5 days, during which temperatures dropped to 30 degrees. Then after 5 days of sitting and waiting with no food or water, he decided to take matters into his own hands and ended up amputating his arm below the elbow. He then rappelled down in hopes of getting to the hospital fast enough to live. Hours after he'd been walking, he encountered 2 hikers in Horseshoe Canyon, and when they found him, they gave him water and called paramedics for him. Ralston's work had actually alerted the rescue crew of his disappearance, telling them that he hadn't shown up for work all week.
Starting us off with number 10 is Tilly Tutor. That is her real name actually, in fact. So back in 2000, 83-year-old Tilly Tutor was tasked with picking up her granddaughter from the airport. But instead of landing at a decent time, the flight was delayed, and so Tilly left the house like 2:30 a.m. to pick her up. Now as she was driving down the I-595, a drunk driver rear-ended the hell out of her car, and it went over the side of the elevated road and down 40 feet below. Never drink and drive, people. It is the most selfish thing you can do. Call an Uber, grab a taxi, stay your friends, have a designated sober driver. With all these options, if you willingly get into a car drunk and drive, any blood is on your hands solely. That is all your responsibility. That was your choice. The PSA is over now. Back to the story. As the car fell, Tilly's phone fell out the window as the car landed in a bunch of mangrove trees and a snake-infested swampland. Did I mention she had just found out she was diabetic the day before? This is not boding well at all for Tilly. Anyway, when she failed to show up to the airport, her granddaughter got worried and called the police, which led to the search. It took 78 hours to find her, during which Tilly survived off a cough drop, a stick of gum, and the rainwater that she was managing to collect somehow. When she was found, she shared that she had started talking to a brown fly who she thought held the spirit of her dead mother. Yeah, Tilly's gonna need some major R&R after that experience. For sure.
Coming in number 9, we have Savannah Todd. Getting kidnapped as a baby would be wild because you would grow up with a life that is a complete lie and never know the truth about who you are. This is what happened to Savannah Todd. She lived her whole life in Australia, thinking she was born there and that her mom moved to Queensland many years ago to settle down and build a family. She knew her mom was from the States, but strangely enough, she never wanted to go back to visit and never talked about any family that she had back there. Well, things started to unravel when one day her mom got drunk and spilled the beans about her past to some of her friends. Turns out Savannah Todd didn't even know she wasn't even Savannah Todd. Her real name was Samantha, and her mom kidnapped her when she was a little baby and took her to Australia from America. Who did she kidnap her from? Well, her father, who had just won full custody of his daughter in a divorce. Savannah, who now knew her real name was Samantha, would meet her father for the first time in her conscious life, and her whole world would be turned upside down. And then she also, how does the Fresh Prince song go? I can't remember. Next!
At number 8, we have Natasha Kampusch. Back in 1998, at the age of 10, Austrian native Natasha was kidnapped from her own home early in the morning by Wolfgang Pricklupil. Eyewitnesses saw her being forced into a minibus by 2 men, and after she failed to show up to school that day, the missing persons report was filed. Tracking the minibus actually led police to Wolfgang's house, and he told them he was home that morning of the kidnapping, and they thought that was a good enough explanation for them. No need to just investigate further. Either way, for the next 8 years, Natasha was kept locked up in a small cellar under his garage. It was completely soundproof, it was only 5 meters big, the door was concrete reinforced with steel, so yes, really no one could hear her scream. She was barely allowed to go outside the cellar, but on her 18th birthday, Wolfgang let her go outside with him, but told her he'd kill her if she made a sound. He would beat her till she couldn't walk and starve her so she'd be too weak to even try to escape. She once even tried to jump out of a moving car to escape, but was quickly re-caught. In August of 2008, Natasha was cleaning Wolfgang's car outside when he got a phone call. While he was distracted, she made a break for it and managed to get help from a 71-year-old neighbor who called the police. When Wolfgang found out he was going to be caught, he went on the run and jumped in front of a train, killing himself. But at least Natasha was alive. Not alive and well, but alive.
Coming at number 7, we have the Micronesian boaters. Getting lost at sea would be one of the scariest things that could ever happen to you. You're just floating around out there in the middle of the ocean and you have no idea if you're ever going to be found. This is what happened to 3 dudes from Micronesia who were making some deliveries between some of the smaller islands surrounding the mainland of Micronesia. While transporting goods, a storm moved through. It was supposed to be clear skies that day, but rough water stormed through and sent the boat thrashing through the water. They were all experienced at navigating the waters, but even they were not able to stop the boat from sinking, and the 3 men had to abandon ship and start swimming to the closest island. This endeavor took them the entire night, but they finally made it to the shore. Now where were they? They were stuck on an abandoned island, and who knows how long they would be stuck there for. They spent the next few days making SOS signs out of bushes and trying to signal down help. Luckily, they were rescued 3 days after being shipwrecked.
Now at number 6 is Jan Broberg. If you're unaware, this case is also what the Netflix documentary Abducted in Plain Sight is about as well. I mean, so if you haven't watched it, then spoiler alert. Now back in 1974 and 76, 12-year-old Jan was abducted by her neighbor Robert Berchtold. He told her he wanted to take her horse riding, but what really happened was he dosed her with a sedative, flew the 2 of them out to Mexico, and then married her. The parents were in denial and thought she was still on the horse riding trip, and it took the FBI getting involved for them to be like, okay, maybe she isn't coming back. Now the first time she went missing, Robert had told her she was part alien since she had been taken by a UFO. She had to fulfill her mission by having a child with a human man, and he just happened to volunteer. Her parents even signed documents stopping the search for Robert, which was very odd. Why would you stop the search for the man who has your kid? Now the second time he kidnapped her, he enrolled her in school and pretended to be her dad. All the while her real parents were calling him asking if he knew where she was, which he kept denying. 3 months later, authorities found her with Robert, and by then he had violated her 200+ times.
Coming in number 5 with Julian Hernandez, another wild case of being kidnapped as a baby. Julian Hernandez grew up his whole life thinking that he never knew his mom. This was just his reality and he didn't think much of it. Some people don't get dealt the best hand. He went all the way through elementary school and high school without knowing the truth about who he was. It wasn't until he was 18 years old and he decided for the first time that he was going to get a job, that's when he would find out the truth. So Julian went to get a social security number and he immediately was flagged. Not the thing you want to hear when you're trying to get your life together. What was it for? Had he committed a crime? Was he wanted for something mysterious? Well, he actually had been missing since he was a baby. His mother had put out a missing persons report as soon as he disappeared. What happened was his father kidnapped him and moved across the country.
At number 4 is Rick Hazelton. So back in 1986, Rick Hazelton went missing from Glens Falls, New York, and after not hearing anything or finding new leads about him, his family declared him legally dead a few decades later. Now his childhood best friend Brian Pinchon had since become a retired Fort Edward police officer who decided to look at his friend's case one more time. Now while doing his research, Brian found a picture of someone that he thought looked exactly like Rick. So him, along with a Nashville detective, got some more information and found an address. The 2 sent Rick's supposed address a letter in the mail reading, "You're being investigated in a missing persons report," and he was like, since when? 2 weeks later, the police showed up at Rick's door to ask what the hell was going on. Apparently he wanted to make his own life and didn't really think anyone cared about where he was going and what he was doing. Shortly after going missing, he tried his hand at street performing, and when that went bust, he moved to Miami, then Colorado, finally settling down in Oregon, where he's been for the past 20 years. There weren't any phones or social media back then, so it's not like he purposely tried to go missing, he just kinda lost touch with his family and friends. I don't know how you lose touch for 33 years and not care, but okay, Rick Hazelton.
Coming in at number 3, we have William Harrison. William Harrison was an explorer back in 1660. This dude was known to travel all over Europe. One day, he just disappeared. At first, people thought he must have slipped up and gotten killed, but rumors started to surface that he had been murdered. That's some spicy gossip. But even with all this information coming forward about the possible murder, no one could put the pieces together as to who took this man's life. And then out of nowhere, a year later, this man just showed up. See, he was quite a wealthy man, and he had claimed that he had been kidnapped but escaped.
Now Now at number 2 are the victims. How horrific would it be for someone to have lost a family member to a serial killer? I don't know what's worse, actually losing them like that, or thinking you did but then finding out they're alive, they just wanted nothing to do with you. I'll let you guys ponder over that one on your own. Now, so I'm sure most of you have heard of the clown killer John Wayne Gacy, since we've covered him a bunch of times on the channel. Now in the 70s, 19-year-old Harold Wayne Lovell went missing. And keep in mind, Harold used to do Gacy's yard work and even left a bunch of his belongings in Gacy's house. And I mean, do the math. So if someone goes missing and the last place they were was a serial killer's house, take a wild guess where that person is or how alive they are. His family assumed he was missing or dead, which makes complete sense. Anyone would think that. Well, turns out Harold was very much alive and well, living his life in Florida, straight up vibing. Apparently he'd left home because of a family situation and had zero idea that his family thought he was missing or dead. He even said that Gacy tried to get him into his house multiple times, but he'd always say no. And Harold's not even Gacy's only supposed victim that turned up alive. Robert Hutton was one and Theodore Shallow was another.
And for the number 1 spot, we got back Harridan Kakamov. This literally sounds like a story from a comic book. You have a man that is almost dead, then he arrives into a new life that is better than anything he could have imagined. Kakamov was a soldier in the Soviet army when he was sent out to fight for his country when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan back in the 80s. During combat, Kakamov was killed, or so all his fellow soldiers thought. He was struck in the head by either a bullet or shrapnel, but the wound looked like it should have been fatal, so his comrades just left him there. Well, turns out this dude was still kicking, and some people from a local Afghani village found the fading soul and took him in, nursed him back to health, and gave him a second chance at life. Kakamov was now alive, and after coming so close to death, he decided to stay with the people who saved his life. He was found 33 years later, living in the village under the name Sheikh Abdullah. He had taken up a new life as a healer and had a beautiful family.